Senator Cornyn.
Thank you all for being here. Mr. Shriver, I like your characterization of the tyranny of time and distance when it comes to the Taiwan contingency. We like to talk about very euphemistic terms, which could be a bloody and very destructive military conflict. First, let me ask you about supply chains. The reason why Senator Warner and I and many of our colleagues joined together and passed the CHIPS and Science Act starting back in 2020, but then finally, I guess, in 2022, was because we were worried about the supply chains of advanced semiconductors and the fact that the United States only made about 12% of those. And the fact that in this world we live in, we are extraordinarily dependent on that sort of technology for everything from our iPhones to the avionics and the Joint Strike Fighter. Are there other supply chains that we need to be concerned about in the event of another pandemic, natural disaster, or a military conflict in the Indo-Pacific? And I would invite anybody to offer any advice now, and if you want to get back to us with a more comprehensive list, I would welcome that.
Thank you, Senator. I think when you look at something like chips, you got to understand the component parts, which gets down to critical minerals and the mining and the processing, and so it's a very complex supply chain. And where I think we can do better now to better position us for resiliency in the event of a conflict is to really look at alternate sources of critical minerals and that processing and that whole sort of chain of production. Right now, we are heavily reliant on China.
Yeah, China processes 90%.
Yeah,
90%, as I recall. Any other thoughts on supply chains from the other panelists?
I just want to add that there's no entity that is in a better position to protect U.S. interests than the United States itself. And when we pull out of the Indo-Pacific, we are basically outsourcing that to another country like China. And China itself has a Made in China 2025, Standards 2035. They've identified 15 areas where not only do they want to be self-sufficient so that we have less power to shape their decisions, but they've been very explicit that they want the world to be reliant on them precisely so they have this type of leverage that you are talking about. In any scenario involving Taiwan, the Chinese are hoping this is going to be a quick war, 3 to 4 weeks. And even in those types of scenarios, the disruption economically is going to be significant. But the United States needs to be in the position that we could intervene in that time frame so that what we threaten is much more of a global disruption to the Chinese themselves.
Well, because time is so short, let me start with Dr. Cha on this question. You talk about how long the Taiwan contingency conflict will last. My impression from traveling in the region is that we have a lot of wonderful allies that have capabilities, and they vary a lot depending on the nation. But we've seen in Ukraine, there's a difference between capability and will. And one of the things that I am very concerned about is we are overestimating what our allies might be willing to do. I think, Dr. Castro, you mentioned they're reluctant to take sides. That seemed to be the typical response we got as we were talking to folks in the Indo-Pacific. But in terms of, and I know this is a hard question and maybe one we don't want to confront, but I don't think we have any choice but to confront. If there was a shooting war in the South China Sea, where, according to President Xi's instructions to the PLA, they needed to be ready by 2027 to essentially take Taiwan, who can we depend on? What countries? And if you could list those in terms of our, who would be the most likely and who would be the most effective, that would be very useful.
Well, sir, if I can just say, we can depend on Japan to allow us access to U.S. bases at the very least. Japanese logistical support will be critical, but that will only come into play in a more protracted conflict if the United States does intervene in time. The northern Philippines and southwest Japan are the only areas in combat radius of Taiwan. And so the immediate support of use of U.S. bases, and in the Philippines in particular, we're not investing right now in the types of air and naval capabilities that we need to be able to respond in a timely manner in the Taiwan Strait. But if we did that, it would basically be the almost immediate permission to use those bases in the northern Philippines and southwest Japan for direct kinetic action against the ships making their way across the strait. That would be by far the most critical. And then in a more protracted conflict, other basing options like in Australia and in the second island chain become more important. But immediate approval from Japan to use those bases, like within hours, is the most important thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. The only thing I would add is the point about the duration of the conflict and the scope of it. If the duration of the conflict and the scope extends beyond the first island chain, second island chain, even Indian Ocean, then that necessarily will bring other players in. And if it gets to that level, I think we would be able to count on some of those players, even potentially the Europeans, to help as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator